The Subcommittee on Government Operations of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform and the Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Training of the Committee on Education and the Workforce will come to order. And without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Today, we gather to review the federal government's first performance-based organization, the Office of the Federal Student Aid. In 1998, amendments to the Higher Education Act transformed FSA into a federal experiment, one that many don't realize is still ongoing. Driving this transformation was an idea that innovation would foster by bringing private sector talent into the government, giving that talent independence from the parent agency, providing generous compensation, and then holding that talent accountable. Today's goal is simple. We're going to evaluate FSA's performance since it was granted these responsibilities and flexibilities. There is no doubt that FSA is tasked with a far greater responsibility today than ever could have been imagined or anticipated in 1998. The federal student aid system is vast, complex, and growing. And pre-application of the federal student aid was just being put on the World Wide Web. Today, FSA processes over 22 million applications annually, and 99% of those applications are processed electronically. 8 million Pell Grants were awarded annually, costing $6.7 billion. Today, it is 8.3 million Pell Grants that are awarded by FSA annually, costing close to $32 billion. In 1998, FSA owned and managed $45 billion in direct loans outstanding principals, and the other $150 billion was funded and owned by a public-private partnership in the FFEL program. Today, FSA owns and manages a staggering amount of $1.18 trillion in federal assets. Now, while FSA's responsibility has increased dramatically, there has not been an increase in accountability. Let's be clear. Congress has not done its part. We created this thing and then walked away. Congress has only called the FSA's chief operating officer, the owner of the PBO, to testify 3 times since 2010. This entire enterprise was set up for oversight, but in the halls of Congress, we need to do better. Now, while I acknowledge Congress has to be clear, FSA is failing to live up to its side of the deal as well. One only recent management challenges report for evidence that FSA is failing to deliver. Each challenge, the IG flag this time around, was raised in last year's report as well. And these are not insignificant challenges, but mission-critical areas that FSA must manage effectively. These areas include improper payment reporting, oversight and monitoring, and IT system development and implementation, of which we heard in this very room yesterday some of the challenges there. And I'm concerned that FSA made significant progress to be removed from the GAO's high-risk list in 2005, but now it's backsliding. And I'm doubly concerned about the culture being fostered by FSA. We will hear from school stakeholders today that the working relationship with FSA has become so strenuous that it is having an adverse effect on ultimately those people that they should be serving, the students. During the committee's hearing yesterday, the department received an F for its failure to effectively secure the personal information of millions of students across the country. Today, I suspect Washington may receive an F for allowing the Office of Federal Student Aid to expand into higher education. I'm not convinced it's been a healthy endeavor for students, parents, or taxpayers, but I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and now turn to the ranking member, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney, for her opening statement.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman, for calling this important hearing. As I understand it, the goal of today's hearing is to examine the Office of Federal Student Aid within the Department of Education. FSA is what is known as, and I quote, performance-based organization, end quote. These entities have greater independence from the other agencies, more flexible hiring authority, and additional contracting flexibility, and they generally are more siloed from the rest of the other agencies. Some have suggested that this was a Clinton administration decision. In fact, the Clinton administration proposed this concept for the Department of Commerce, but it was Congress that created FSA within the Department of Education as a performance-based organization in 1998. Creating it as a performance-based organization were Representative Buck McKeon, Representative William Clay, Rep. William Goodling, and Rep. Dale Kildee. During the markup of the legislation in committee, Doug McKeon said this, and I quote, "For the first time, the day-to-day management of our student aid programs will be in the hands of someone with real-world experience in financial services. This individual will be given the hiring and contracting flexibility necessary to get results and will be paid based on performance. For the first time, the Department's student aid systems will be run like a business, adopting the best practices from the private sector and focusing on bottom-line results," end quote. Rep. McKeon's legislation passed the House with broad bipartisan vote of 414 to 4. In fact, every member of Congress who is here today and was serving when this legislation was passed voted for it. The reason was simple. A few years earlier, the Government Accountability Office had added student loans to its high-risk list of programs that are especially vulnerable to waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement. As GAO stated at the time, the program had, and I quote, "generally succeeded in providing access to money for education," end quote, but was, and I quote, "less successful in protecting the taxpayers' financial interest," end quote. As a result of significant work over the next few years, by 2005, GAO was able to remove student financial aid programs from its high-risk list, citing, and I quote, "sustained improvements to address its financial management and internal control weaknesses," end quote. That was great news. I want to be clear that I agree that Congress should examine whether it still makes sense today, 18 years later, to keep FSA as a performance-based organization. As Rep. Connolly said at yesterday's hearing, we may want to consider bringing the department up to date, particularly in the area of IT and data contracts. That is something I hope we can explore today. I also feel very strongly that we have to examine the actions of the student loan services. In August, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau notified Navient, one of the nation's biggest student loan servicers, that after a 2-year investigation, it had enough evidence to indicate this company violated consumer protection laws and was considering taking legal action against the company for its late fee practices, among other potential abuses. A year earlier, in 2014, Navient had to pay $60 million to compensate tens of thousands of military service members as part of a settlement with the Department of Justice for a, and I quote, "nationwide pattern of violating the Service Members Civil Rights Relief Act." Navient also entered into a settlement with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation for, and I quote, "deceptive and unfair acts and practices." These included, and I quote, "allocating underpayments in a manner that maximizes late fees incurred by consumers," end quote. Unfortunately, we do not have Navient or any other servicers here today. I hope we'll have the opportunity to question them at a future hearing. Finally, while this hearing today and our hearing yesterday are important, the much more urgent priority for students in this country is addressing the exploding cost of college and the crippling debt students face when they graduate and enter the workforce. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities issued a report recently warning that 47 states are now, and I quote, "spending less per student in the 2014-15 school year than they did at the start of the recession." In fact, the average state has cut spending by 20% per student compared to the 2007 and 8 school year. As a result, GAO reports that, and I quote, by fiscal year 2012, tuition had overtaken state funding as a source of revenue for public colleges, end quote. This is a national emergency. The Obama administration and Democrats in Congress have tried to make significant improvements. For example, we successfully converted student loans to the Direct Loan Program, saving tens of billions of dollars. The administration has made other proposals, but many require statutory changes. So it is up to us here in Congress to act. The most critical higher education challenge confronting our nation is how students will pay for the ever-increasing cost of college. I hope we can focus at least some of today's discussion on this issue, and I hope we will hold another hearing in the near future to address this critical challenge. Again, I thank you for focusing on one of the most important issues in our country, the education of our young people. I thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. I now welcome and recognize the chairman of the Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Training of the Committee on Education and the Workforce, the gentlelady from North Carolina, Dr. Fox, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Meadows. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's joint hearing. The title of the committees are too long. I thank Chairman Meadows for working with our committee on an issue that's critical to serving the best interest of students, families, and taxpayers. I'm a firm believer that collaborative efforts such as this are what most often produce the practical solutions the American people deserve. We all know that the current federal financial system is broken. That deserves repeating. We all know that the current federal financial aid system is broken. National student loan debt's at an all-time high, and a complex patchwork of grant, loan, and repayment programs has become so difficult to navigate that it often discourages individuals from pursuing a higher education. Students, families, and taxpayers deserve better. That's why simplifying and improving student aid remains a leading priority as Congress continues its work to strengthen higher education. Addressing the challenges within the federal financial aid system is an important part of that effort, and one we have discussed extensively in our subcommittee. But that's not why we're here today. Instead, we're here to examine the agency tasked with managing the system, the Office of Federal Student Aid, or FSA. The agency is responsible for administering every federal loan, grant, work study, and repayment program under Title IV of the Higher Education Act. In other words, FSA is in charge of delivering billions of taxpayer dollars to millions of eligible students, as well as managing more than $1 trillion of outstanding student loan debt. Additionally, the agency is expected to provide guidance about financial aid policies to thousands of colleges and universities, and has the authority to revoke an institution's ability to participate in the aid programs should they not comply with that guidance. Needless to say, FSA plays an enormous role in the higher education system and has the ability to help or disrupt the lives of students. In the 1990s, the Government Accountability Office designated FSA as a, quote, high-risk agency with long-standing management problems, end quote. To improve the efficiency and effectiveness of FSA and to mitigate the mishandling of limited resources moving forward, Congress in 1998 converted the agency to a performance-based organization that would have to meet specific objectives under the Higher Education Act. Nearly 2 decades and trillions of dollars later, many would argue FSA is not achieving the intended results. It's our job to find out why and identify opportunities for reform to ensure taxpayer dollars are well spent and students are well served. Numerous reports reveal FSA is rife with inefficiencies that have led to a lack of communication with students, institutions, and loan servicers, improper payments, inaccurate reporting of data, failure to ensure borrowers are aware of the repayment options available to them, mismanagement of contractors and vendors, poor customer service, and I could go on, but we only have a limited time. After the last comprehensive review of the agency in 2008, the Department of Education's Office of Inspector General found FSA has failed to meet its responsibility as a performance-based organization. such as developing a 5-year performance plan with external stakeholders and establishing annual performance reviews for the agency's top executives. Due to these and other failures, the Inspector General noted that FSA, quote, has been unable to realize the expected benefits of the initiatives and has hindered its progress in meeting the requirements of the Higher Ed Act. This is about more than checking. When FSA fails to fulfill its responsibility, it jeopardizes hard-working taxpayers' money intended to help students. We need to demand better as Congress works to strengthen higher education interests of students, families, and taxpayers. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about how to achieve just that. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you again, Chairman Meadows, for working with us on this important hearing. Before I conclude my opening remarks, I do want to recognize our colleague, Congressman Hinojosa, who announced last week his decision not to seek re-election after serving nearly 20 years in Congress. As the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce, Mr. Hinojosa has been an ardent champion for students, families, and workers. Mr. Hinojosa is to be commended for his service to our country, and I wish him and his family all the best in the years ahead. I yield back.
I thank the chairwoman for her eloquent words, and now recognizing the gentleman of which we owe a debt of gratitude to, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce, the gentleman from Texas, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Meadows, and especially Chairwoman Fox, for your very kind and generous remarks. I really appreciate everything you said, and we will visit on that. I also want to thank Ranking Member Maloney for holding this important hearing. Today's Joint Committee hearing will examine the Office of Federal Student Aid as a performance-based organization and the management and administration of these programs. I want to welcome our distinguished panel of witnesses for joining us this morning to share their views on how the federal government can continue to best serve our students. As we've heard this morning, the Office of Federal Student Aid, known as FSA, became a PBO as a part of the 1998 Reauthorization of Higher Education Act and was the first PBO established by Congress to manage the operational functions supporting financial aid programs. This model was crucial for the Department of Education to provide necessary services to our students and to ensure efficiency and accountability. While the focus on today's joint hearing is on FSA's performance as a PBO, some of my colleagues may attempt to discredit FSA, the Federal Student Aid, and its work in successfully transitioning to the direct loan program. In my view, the department's move to direct lending in 2010 continues to provide students with a streamlined loan origination system, and it provides the department with better oversight against fraud, waste, and abuse. Ladies and gentlemen, I must underscore that while there is always room for improvement, I understand that FSA has been working to address areas of improvement for quite some time, and I want to emphasize 3 points which contributed to address the need to improve accessibility and affordability of higher education. First, we must remember that FSA is the largest provider of financial aid for students in the United States. In 2015, FSA delivered approximately $128 billion in federal student aid to nearly 12 million students at 6,100 institutions of higher education, amounts that had never been reached before in our country's history. Secondly, I am also aware that FSA has worked diligently to ensure students are receiving their financial aid funds in a timely manner so that they can pay for their education and be ready on the first day of classes. Thirdly, FSA is responsible for managing programs that ease the burden of student loan debt for borrowers. FSA plays a vitally important role in helping borrowers repay their student loans through income-driven repayment plans. At the same time, I must express my concerns regarding student loan servicers. Several investigations and reports, including a report issued by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, have found that federal student loan servicers have not provided appropriate services and guidance and protections to borrowers. So with this in mind, I applaud the Obama administration for taking steps to make college more affordable for students and families by issuing a Students' Aid Bill of Rights to give every borrower the right to an affordable repayment plan. Furthermore, every borrower has the right to quality customer service, reliable information, and fair treatment. Along those same lines, the Departments of Education, the Treasury, and Consumer Financial Protection Bureau issued joint principles on student loan servicing in September of this year. This is a positive step in the right direction. I wish to remind my colleagues that every student, regardless of their socioeconomic status, has an equal opportunity to post-secondary education and access to financial aid. As you're aware, tuition costs and student loan debts have risen exponentially, surpassing the $1.2 trillion that Chairwoman Fox mentioned. We must do all that we can to help borrowers repay their debt. With that, I look forward to hearing from our distinguished guests on these matters, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I will hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who wish to provide and submit a written statement. We'll now recognize our panel of witnesses. I'm pleased to welcome Mr. James Runcie, who currently serves as the Chief Operating Officer at the U.S. Department of Education. Mr. Runcie served as the Deputy Chief Operating Officer of FSA from 2010 to 2011 and Acting Chief Operating Officer of the Department of Education until his full appointment in 2012. Welcome. I welcome Ms. Melissa Emery Aris, is that correct? All right, serves as the Director of Education and Workforce and Income Security at the Government Accountability Office. She oversees national studies on both K through 12 and higher education issues. Welcome back Ms. Kathleen Tai. Currently serves as the Inspector General at the U.S. Department of Education. Ms. Tai also chairs the Council of Inspector Generals on the Integrity and Efficiency, and in 2011 was appointed by President Obama to the Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board and the Government Accountability and Transparency Board. Welcome. Welcome Mr. Ben Miller, currently serves as a Senior Director of Post-Secondary Education at the Center of American Progress. Mr. Miller previously served as the Director for Higher Education at New America, as well as a Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the Department. And also welcome Mr. Justin Draeger, currently serves as the President and CEO of the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. In this capacity, he serves as the primary voice of the NAS, FAA, and the liaison between the 3,000 financial and aid offices in Congress and the federal government. Welcome to you all, and thank you for being here. Pursuant to Oversight and Government Reform Committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify, so I'd ask that you please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. And in order to allow time for discussion, we would appreciate if you would please limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. However, your entire written statement will be made part of the record. Mr. Runcie, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Meadows, Chairwoman Fox, and Ranking Members Maloney and Hinojosa, and members of the committee for the opportunity to discuss federal student aid as a PBO. My name is James Runcie, and I serve as FSA's Chief Operating Officer. FSA is the largest source of federal student aid for post-secondary education in the U.S. During fiscal year 2015, we delivered more than $127 billion in aid to more than 13 million students attending approximately 6,100 post-secondary institutions. During this time, we processed nearly 20 million FAFSAs, Our loan portfolio is currently more than $1.2 trillion, with 42 million individual recipients and 193 million loans. We use a public-private partnership that leverages almost 1,300 federal employees and more than 12,000 contracted employees. Since FSA became a PBO, we have numerous successes in transforming the delivery of student aid. FSA has responded to rapidly changing landscapes in the delivery of federal student aid. To accommodate growth and mitigate risk, FSA contracted with 4 private sector servicers who leverage their commercial practices to expedite the delivery of services. As a result of the capital markets decline in 2008, we injected $112 billion into the markets through ECASLA, ensuring that every student that depended on federal student aid received it. We updated our systems, increased capacity, and provided training to thousands of financial aid professionals at thousands of schools to move to 100% direct lending, and we entered into agreements with not-for-profit loan servicers. We successfully implemented 11 NFPs, and we did all of these things with no negative impact to students and families. The PBO contracting flexibilities allow us to structure contracts in a way that include performance requirements and protections for students and borrowers. Spurred in part by the PBO legislation and landmark procurement laws passed by Congress, FSA has been a government leader in delivering its mission through the adoption of commercial solutions and systems. This year, FSA achieved $150 million in cost avoidance through successful contract negotiations. We have saved $105 million since 2009, thanks to the culture of accountability established by the PBO. We are proud to have earned 14 consecutive annual clean financial statement audit opinions. While we have strengthened our financial position, we also have strengthened our program compliance process to ensure the proper administration of federal student aid funds. We have increased efforts to detect fraud in the FAFSA, and we have significantly reduced the time to complete the online application, more than 1 hour in 2009 to less than 24 minutes in 2015. The FAFSA is but one integrated application among many in our complex operating environment. In 2015, we documented and assessed more than 2,600 internal controls across 36 business processes. We found that 96% of these controls are designed and operate effectively. The remaining 4% had immaterial deficiencies for which we have established corrective actions. Within the last several years, we have effectively launched and implemented major modifications to our operating environment due to legislative, regulatory, and policy changes. Examples include, but certainly are not limited to, the IRS data retrieval tool, new income-driven repayment plans, the 150% direct subsidized loan limit, and a comprehensive enterprise data warehouse. Through the recent cyber sprint, FSA has made significant progress in implementing additional protections to customer data. In addition, the implementation of CyberArk at our virtual data center completed last month has remediated many of our audit access control findings. The need for federal aid will continue to grow, and FSA must continue to adapt. We must be in a position to continue responding to rapid regulatory and market changes, to recruit, retain specialized talent, to negotiate commercial contracting, and to provide the most effective program compliance in order to continue to fulfill our mission. Taking full advantage of each authority granted as a PBO is a critical element to our mission success. The employees that I represent at FSA are focused on the future of the organization, a future that includes the early availability of the FAFSA in October 2016, implementing prior, repay, and servicing improvements, launching a new student complaint system, expanding our oversight capacity, and increasing the security of our systems. I appreciate the opportunity to provide the committee with an overview and welcome any questions that you may have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Runcie. Ms. Emery Arias, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I am pleased to be here today to discuss the results of our work examining FSA's efforts to monitor and oversee the direct loan program. FSA administers the direct loan program and oversees the performance of contractors supporting this program. These contractors include loan servicers responsible for billing and other services, as well as companies managing the department's defaulted loan information system. To address longstanding management weaknesses, the Higher Education Act was amended to establish FSA as the first PBO. A PBO is intended to transform the delivery of public services by committing to achieving specific, measurable goals with targets for improvement. in exchange for being provided with more flexibility to manage its operations. Accordingly, FSA's strategic plan includes several goals focused on monitoring contractors and serving the needs of borrowers. However, recent questions have been raised about FSA's management of the direct loan program, including its oversight of contractors. In March 2014, we found that FSA's limited planning and oversight of its IT contractor prevented education from providing timely benefits to borrowers who completed loan rehabilitation. Loan rehabilitation allows borrowers who make 9 on-time monthly payments in 10 months to have a default removed from their credit reports. However, no rehabilitations were processed from October 2011 until April 2012 due to issues with FSA's IT system, and FSA officials said they needed until January of 2013 to clear the resulting backlog. My statement today provides additional findings from our recently completed work on FSA's management of the direct loan program and will focus on how well FSA, 1, provides instructions and guidance to direct loan servicers, and 2, monitors and documents calls between direct loan borrowers and servicers. In terms of FSA's instructions and guidance, we found that FSA's communications to loan servicers are sometimes lacking, resulting in inconsistent services to borrowers. 6 of the 7 servicers we interviewed reported various issues resulting from absent, unclear, and inconsistent guidance and instructions. For example, one servicer said there are no instructions for how to apply over or underpayments to borrower accounts. If a borrower has multiple loans, some servicers spread an overpayment amount evenly across the loans, while other servicers target the higher interest loans first. Furthermore, FSA is not consistently sharing all clarifications on direct loan program instructions with all servicers. Accordingly, we are recommending today that FSA review and improve how it provides instruction and guidance to servicers. In terms of FSA's call monitoring process, we found that FSA's monitoring has methodological weaknesses and is poorly documented. For example, we found that FSA monitors far fewer outbound calls than inbound calls, even though one servicer told us that it makes 60 times more outbound calls than inbound calls, and the outbound calls are made to borrowers who are often delinquent and at risk of default. Also, the methodology for selecting calls for review is not well defined and relies on servicers to implement with no verification from FSA to ensure its integrity. Accordingly, we are recommending today that FSA implement a more rigorous methodology for monitoring calls. In addition, we found weaknesses in how FSA documents the results of its call monitoring. For example, summaries of monitored calls did not consistently track errors over time. In addition, the monthly summary reports only capture errors if 4 or more occur in the same call. If a servicer fails to answer all of a borrower's questions but does not compound this problem with 3 additional errors, the report does not capture this information. Accordingly, we are recommending today that FSA improve documentation of its call monitoring. FSA faces challenges in the direct loan program that affect its ability to function effectively as a PBO. If FSA fails to strengthen its instructions and guidance to servicers and improve call monitoring, differences between servicers will persist that could financially hurt borrowers or risk the integrity of the program. Thank you. This concludes my statement.
Thank you. Inspector General Tai, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you all for inviting me here today to discuss the work of the Office of Inspector General involving the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Federal Student Aid as a performance-based organization. As many of you know, the federal student aid programs have long been a major focus of our audit and investigative work, as these programs are large, complex, and susceptible to fraud and abuse. We look to promote efficiency and effectiveness in FSA programs and operations, and in doing so, help to protect America's students from harm and help safeguard the taxpayers' investment in higher education. As already noted during this hearing, FSA did about $130 billion in student aid this year to 13 million students, and manage an outstanding loan portfolio that has grown to $1.2 trillion. This makes FSA one of the financial institutions in the country. As a PBO, FSA is responsible for managing both the oversight and administrative functions that support these programs. In 2008, we determined that FSA was not completely fulfilling its responsibilities as a PBO in the areas of systems integration, cost reduction, and planning and reporting. The work we have performed since 2008 has focused in significant part on areas within FSA's oversight and administrative responsibilities. That work continues to identify problems in FSA's oversight of program participants. For example, our 2015 audit found weaknesses in FSA's process for performing program reviews, including that staff did not adequately document fiscal testing for timely disbursements or determine whether schools had implemented direct loan quality assurance systems, and there was limited evidence of supervisory reviews, all of which may leave FSA with limited assurance that program reviews are appropriately identifying and reporting instances of noncompliance. Another 2015 audit found that FSA's follow-up process for OIG's external audits was not always effective, as audits were not always closed timely, and FSA did not always maintain appropriate documentation to show that corrective actions were completed. Not ensuring corrective actions are taken as quickly as possible allows deficiencies to continue to exist, and the risk remains that related programs are not effectively managed and that taxpayer funds are not being used as intended. FSA as a PBO also has the responsibility for managing the administrative functions of the Title IV programs. Recent OIG work has identified weaknesses in this area. For example, results from our recent improper payments audits found that FSA has not taken full advantage of the Improper Payments Elimination and Recovery Act to identify and reduce improper payments in the Pell Grant and direct loan programs. We have identified issues with FSA's improper payment methodologies that render its improper payment estimates for these programs inaccurate, incomplete, and unreliable. OIG work conducted over the last several years has always in FSA's contract management, an area of concern as FSA relies heavily on contractor support to accomplish the purposes of the PBO. We have seen weaknesses in FSA's monitoring of its debt management system, its contracts with the Title IV servicers, and its contracts with private collection agencies. We have identified issues such as not ensuring contract milestones were met, lack of proper invoice validation, and the failure to confirm the adequacy of deliverables, and the failure to ensure adequate IT security of contractor-operated systems. Without improved contractor monitoring, FSA has limited assurance it is receiving the products and services it is paying for, impacting both students' and taxpayers' interests. My written testimony provides more detailed information on these findings, as well as other examples of our recent work that shows that FSA needs to improve its oversight and management so as to ensure Title IV programs are serving the interests of students. For the next reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, Congress may want to consider adding specific requirements for oversight and contract management to the purposes and functions of the PBO and require FSA's performance plans to establish measurable goals and objectives in these areas. My office is committed to working with FSA, the Department, and Congress to address the areas of risk within the federal student aid programs to reduce fraud and abuse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Inspector General, and thank you for your insightful report. Mr. Miller, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Meadows, Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Maloney, and Ranking Member Hinojosa, and members of the committee for having me today. This month marks the 50th anniversary of the Higher Education Act, landmark legislation that has made our country stronger by allowing millions of low and middle-income Americans to access and afford college. But today, the growing price of college threatens to undermine the goals of the Higher Education Act. State disinvestment keeps driving public tuition higher. No longer can part-time work afford tuition bills, and family incomes have stagnated. As a result, federal student loans are now the norm for people in college. Today, over 40 million Americans owe a collective $1.18 trillion in federal student loans. 70% of bachelor's degree graduates borrow for college. Under current law, the Federal Student Aid Office, or FSA, cannot fix the underlying conditions that lead students to borrow. But a strong, effective, and efficient FSA is still important for students. It can help them apply for aid easily, get dollars to them when they need it, guide them through the repayment process, and protect them from bad actors lurking throughout the system. In the last several years, FSA has done a lot to meet these goals. It has made applying for aid simpler and faster by using skip logic on questions and allowing for the easy importation of tax data. Next fall, it will implement a policy change known as prior year that helps families apply for aid sooner and better plan for college costs. This idea has bipartisan, bicameral support. FSA has also implemented repayment options that allow borrowers to make affordable payments based upon their income. Perhaps the greatest sign of FSA's recent successes was the 2010 transition following legislation that required all federal loans be issued by the Department of Education. FSA worked with thousands of institutions to make this change in just 3 months, and students saw no interruption in their flow of aid dollars. This change also saved taxpayers money by no longer having to pay expensive subsidies and guarantees to lenders in exchange for offering an undifferentiated product whose terms were set by Congress. These are all important developments that have helped the government's benefits work better for the students who receive them. They show FSA's strong commitment to getting dollars to students quickly and on time, and they show the importance of having an agency structure with clear goals for efficiency and effectiveness. Still, there are places where federal student aid can be strengthened, possibly through changes to its structure. For one, FSA and Congress must determine how to better use oversight tools and accountability metrics to protect students from institutions that take advantage of them. Yesterday's announcement that 85,000 former Corinthian students may be eligible for loan discharges, and Monday's nearly $100 million settlement between the federal government and the Education Management Corporation show the importance of early action to weed out bad colleges. The government alleged EDMC improperly compensated recruiters, leading an operation where it sought anyone with, quote, a Pell and a pulse. Yet the company still received billions in federal aid over the last several years. Second, FSA should demand its contractors better serve students. Today, it contracts with 4 companies to service the majority of federal student loans and is required to work with several others through a congressional earmark. In the mid-2000s, the Inspector General found that 3 of the 4 main servicers and several of the earmarked ones had improperly billed the government millions of dollars for inflated loan subsidies. One of them also settled a claim by the U.S. Department of Justice for overcharging service members. These are servicers whose prior behavior suggests the need for significant scrutiny to protect students and taxpayers. Fortunately, the move to direct lending and the fact that these individuals are all contractors means that FSA can address these challenges through changes much more easily than it could in the old bank-based system. Finally, the public and policymakers need additional performance data about institutions, servicers, and the loan portfolio. In particular, greater information about loan delinquency by institution, outcomes for borrowers in forbearance, and what happened to borrowers before they defaulted would help guide policy changes that better serve students. A greater for risk analysis could also lead to new pricing structures for servicers and collectors that reward them for helping the most vulnerable borrowers. But strengthening FSA cannot be our only strategy for addressing affordability. We must act to address the underlying structural problems that drive up price and debt. We must tackle state disinvestment and encourage colleges to improve sensibly. Doing so is the best way to ensure the Higher Education Act continues to meet its goals for the next 50 years. Thank you again for having me today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Drager, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Meadows and Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Members Maloney and Hinojosa, thank you for inviting me to testify today. Collectively, NASFA's 3,000-member schools serve 90% of all undergraduates in this country, and the issues I'll describe today are not isolated incidents. 1 out of every 3 schools has reported to NASFA significant operational shortfalls with FSA that unfortunately have only worsened in recent years. Now, as institutions, we view ourselves as partners with FSA, and we celebrate their successes, particularly in regards to simplifying the financial aid form and improving their counseling tools. But these successes notwithstanding, FSA is consistently falling short in other areas, particularly in their partnerships with institutions, and that has detrimental effects on students. In our written remarks, we've included several examples of this lack of partnership, including one where FSA took unilateral action last year without consulting schools that resulted in some students being mistakenly placed into student loan repayment while they were actually still in school. Now, schools are reluctant to complain about this disservice because FSA ultimately holds all the cards in terms of a school being able to offer financial aid funds to students. The underlying perception to our members is that you keep your complaints to a minimum or you risk a federal program review. And this feeds into a second major issue with FSA, its lack of accountability to partners or the public. The most pervasive problems at FSA, and this has been reported by over 1,000 schools in each of your districts serving 6.5 million students, are long delays in program participation agreement changes, long delays in closing out program reviews, delayed guidance in relation to deadlines that institutions have to meet, and even publishing simple benchmarks about how long it should take to get responses on compliance issues. These issues have been going on for years. In fact, in 2012, we provided input to FSA about how they could improve their service to partners. Yet still today, FSA's strategic plans continue to lack appropriate performance metrics that could be used to measure progress on these issues. Of the many examples that we've provided in our written testimony, the most example that can be found that highlights these issues is in FSA's implementation of gainful employment reporting. And who might be unfamiliar, the department recently defined what it means to be gainfully employed, which is a statutory criteria schools have to meet in order to offer financial aid for certificate programs. The entire rollout process can be described as nothing less than a time-consuming debacle that took already limited time away from counseling students. In response to schools' complaints about this process, FSA officials are quick to point out that schools had 9 months to meet this massive data reporting requirement, which quite frankly is intellectually dishonest. We've provided a timeline in our written testimony, also available here in the room, that shows that FSA didn't even begin issuing operational guidance until 3 months after the final regulations were published. Then in the space of 5 months, leading right up to the deadline, FSA issued roughly 300 pages of additional implementation guidance, the bulk of which included a technical reference guide. All of it being issued and updated right up to the reporting deadline. Then, as that reporting deadline came and went, FSA continued to issue guidance on compliance. And here's where it gets truly disturbing. At the same time that ED was continuing to issue guidance to schools, they began sending a series of threatening letters to all types of schools, four-year public, privates, community colleges, and proprietaries, threatening them with administrative incapability findings, a term that basically means that students at those schools could lose financial aid. Now, FSA claims that schools showed a shocking lack of compliance, without even considering the idea that it was perhaps their own rollout and timing that contributed to the bulk of these problems. As it turns out, most of these schools were not out of compliance, simply had data reporting errors that produced conflicting results at FSA. Eventually, 10 weeks after these deadlines and after 2 threatening letters, FSA finally released a tool that schools could actually use to determine whether all the data conflicts had been resolved. And of course, how does this ultimately affect students? Well, one financial aid administrator in Ohio summarized it best when she said, "GE reporting has been an incredibly frustrating experience, an experience and wasted time that could have been more productively spent helping our students and families." Despite these examples that we've cited here, and as best as we can tell, FSA continues through self-assessment to give itself high marks, pay healthy bonuses, and avert responsibility for these persistent issues. See FSA as a partner, but partnership is not a one-way street. We've provided several recommendations on ways that we hope we can address these issues. And despite FSA's many successes, and despite my belief that their staff are as dedicated to students as any financial aid administrator in this country, I also believe we'll continue to have these problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Drager. Again, thanks to all of our witnesses who are here today. I would now like to recognize Mr. Allen for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, panel, for being here today and to talk about this very important work that you do. I mean, 1.18 trillion outstanding in debt, serving 41 million borrowers. That's a big job. And certainly we need to look at this very, very carefully to see if we're getting the results that we want out of this program. One of the things that I hear in my district is that there are lots of jobs, very good paying jobs available. And I've been amazed at my short time here in Congress and on this Education Workforce Committee that there's such a disconnect between the business community or manufacturing or the job creators and those in the education business. And somehow we've got to bring those together because we've got students that are getting an education without the idea of perhaps what they're going to do and how they're going to pay this money back. With that, Mr. Runcie, I'd like to start out with my first question. The bipartisan budget agreement just signed into law allows the federal government and its contractors to use predictive dialing to reach borrowers on their cell phones in order to help them avoid or get out of default. Can you discuss the administration's views on how this technology will aid FSA's efforts to assist these struggling borrowers?
Sure. You know, part of the difficulty of making sure that students do not go into default or late-stage delinquency is being able to reach them. You know, that is sometimes the biggest impediment to making sure that they can get the tools and the resources they need to address some of their default management, you know, issues. And so that is a tool that would be helpful in order to increase some of the efficiencies around reaching out and getting these students and borrowers to act. We've got income-based repayment. We've got lots of tools that they can use that we've rolled out over the last couple of years. And the ability to reach them so that they're aware of these through something like TCPA would be tremendously helpful. Obviously, you know, it's going to take some time to implement, and it's going through a process now, but we stand ready to use that type of technology to address those issues.
So, in other words, the administration is in favor of using this method to get in touch with the students in accordance with the bipartisan budget agreement?
I'm just saying that it would, I believe so, but just from an operational standpoint, it would help outcomes.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Ms. Emery Arias, like I said, we're 41 million borrowers, 1.18 trillion, and the GAO found that the FSA is lacking, resulting in inconsistent and ineffective programs for borrowers. How has the lack of guidance and communication affected services' ability to assist our borrowers?
Basically, servicers treat borrowers differently. So you could have the same borrower with the same financial circumstances, and they might get completely different advice depending on which servicer they contact. This is because education has not provided consistent instructions and guidance to servicers on how to apply payments like underpayments and overpayments, how to deal with different types of income documentation and the like. So there's really missing instruction that could really help ensure consistency and serve borrowers.
Has the FSA been diligent in oversight of this issue?
We believe FSA could do more. For example, servicers we spoke with said it would be very helpful to have a manual, which would be just very simple in terms of what the instructions are for implementing the program to make sure that there is consistency. So that is something that we have put out there as part of our recommendation to provide guidance that FSA consider having a basic operations manual for servicers.
As the chair of our hearing said this morning, Congress obviously needs to step it up. What can Congress do?
Well, we haven't made any recommendations to Congress in this testimony. I'll defer to others on that point.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm just about out of time, so I'll yield back the remainder balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Mr. Hinojosa, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question is to Mr. Runcie. I understand that many borrowers are unaware of the federal government's income-driven repayment plans. What is the FSA doing to increase awareness about income-driven repayment plans that I mentioned?
We have, there are a number of things that, you know, we're doing, but what I want to emphasize is the rate of growth and the take-up in income-based repayment. It's been phenomenal. Right? So a significant percentage of the portfolio, and a growing percent, is now using income-based repayment. A lot of that has to do with, we've had targeted email campaigns, we've changed the incentive structure for our servicers, we've created websites with information about income-based repayment. We've worked with Treasury and Intuit in terms of mechanisms and activities that create awareness around these programs. So we've done a lot, but more importantly, the outcomes are evidencing that the outreach and the awareness that we're putting out there is making a difference.
I'll be back to you. Mr. Ben Miller. As you know, student loan debt stands at the $1.2 trillion that has been repeated over and over again. In your expert opinion, what steps has the Obama administration taken to expand accessibility and affordability in higher ed?
So there's been a number of important steps. And I mean, obviously, the best form of student loan debt is no student loan debt. And this is something where the Obama administration has done a lot, especially beginning with the Recovery Act, where it invested a lot of additional money in federal Pell Grants to help the lowest income students. It then followed that up in 2010 with additional money for Pell Grants by ending the bank-based loan system, which allowed, I believe, about $36 billion to go to Pell Grants. The result is that before this administration came in, the Pell Grant had been a largely stagnant maximum award. It's now gone up by a little bit over $1,000, which has meant a lot for low-income students. In addition, several of the income-driven repayment plans that have already been discussed have been important for helping borrowers manage their debt, so that now basically any borrower who enters repayment knows that they'll be able to cap their loan payments at about 10% of their discretionary income. If they engage in public service, they'll be able to get forgiveness after 10 years, and otherwise they'll be able to get forgiveness after between 20 and 25 years.
I agree with you. Those are very good things that occurred. I was chairman of the committee, and so I agree with you, because we were addressing what the presidents of universities and the chancellors of university systems told us needed to be done. My third question is to Mr. Runcie. Several investigations have found that federal student loan servicers whose contracts are managed by OFS may not be providing appropriate services. September of this year, 2015, the CFPB published a 150-page report detailing the services' issues and policy recommendations to fix the management of loan servicing. What is FSA doing to ensure that those servicers are using due diligence in managing their portfolio?
Yeah, and I believe the CFPB report also included information around sort of private loan servicers as well. FSA has, in October of 2014, we came out with a new incentive structure and pricing model that we provided to all of the servicers, the TIVAs as well as the NFPs. And the structure of that, those contracts and the way the pricing is, it puts a tremendous amount of economic value on keeping students in repayment.
Excuse me, time is running out. Can members of this committee, the two committees, get copies of that latest instruction manual that you are discussing here?
Yes, we can provide the
Well, let me say that as time is running out, I want to say that this is amazing to me, that a business as big as higher education, where we're talking about billions and trillions of dollars, that we don't have penalties for some of these that are violating the rules, like the one that just took bankruptcy and was shut down. What is the name of that organization, that university, private? Corinthian.
Yes.
Yeah. All of this to say that it seems to me that Congress should give instructions that people who violate, as they are, should receive penalties that are to the individuals who are making those decisions. There should be fines and imprisonment. There has to be something that is going to stop this. It was back before 2010, and if I may quickly say that, we were seeing students getting student loans at 10 and 12% from banks and other groups, even from universities. New laws came in, as were pointed out, that we could make direct loans at 5%. And then, of course, the lobbyists came down on us real hard to stop doing that because their banks were not making all that money with guaranteed federal loans. So we really need to really put in some time and come up with penalties that are going to stop that type of decision-making that was going on. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now, Mr. Meadows, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Runcie, I'm going to come directly to you. The oral testimony of Ms. Emery was kinder than perhaps the written testimony that I role is more oversight, not as much on the policy side of things. So how much do we pay out in improper every year?
Well, we have improper payment estimates, right? So we don't actually make payouts, right? So, for instance, we have.
But you have oversight. You're the COO, and so as we look at the improper payments, how much do the American taxpayers can they recognize in terms of improper payments?
So improper payments, there are two categories. There are direct loans and Pell.
Combined, what's the total?
The combined total is about $1.8 billion of estimated improper payments. That's done through sampling techniques, and we look at we look at information, and then we extrapolate that it would be 1 point.
I've only got 5 minutes, so let me interrupt you. If that's your official testimony, I guess my question is how do you know? Because you've changed the methodology, didn't you, Mr. Runcie, and how you evaluated improper payments?
That methodology was approved by OMB. So
you changed it in fiscal year 2013.
That's right.
And then the improper payments amount doubled. Is that correct? That's the information I have.
We changed
from about $2 billion to about $4 billion.
No, it's about $2 billion. I'm not sure the time frame that you're talking about, but the estimated improper payment.
How many times have you changed the way that you figure improper payments, Mr. Runcie?
Once since I've been at FSA. So we changed it.
Well, I'm going to give you a chance to check with your folks behind you because I have information that would indicate you've changed it twice.
Okay. So what I'm saying is that when we change the improper payment methodology, it's based upon some analysis that we do. That analysis was, we had some disagreement in terms of the appropriateness of that.
I'd say major disagreement, so let me go on a little bit further. So let me interrupt because I need to get to an answer here.
Okay.
Here's my concern. You have improper payments of about $2 billion under a scenario that you're, and I'm rounding off.
That's right.
You change the scenario after that same method of calculating it showed that you had $4 billion in improper payments, and you go retroactively to OMB and say, we want a new process to be able to evaluate that. Is that, in general terms, how it worked?
The OMB, my understanding is OMB is the authority. If they sign off on it, it is
I agree.
valid and it's appropriate.
All right, so are you following OMB guidelines?
OMB
Be careful how you answer.
OMB has approved the methodology that we use.
Are you using their approved methodology?
We are using it. That's what we use for 2015 and 2014.
So let me ask you this then. Their methodology, from what I understand, would include a sample size of 300, and yet according to the information I have, you're only analyzing 79 cases, which is statistically not accurate. It's not even following what OMB has indicated. Are my numbers correct?
I don't have the numbers.
Ms. Tai, are they correct?
Yes, FSA originally went to OMB with a sample size of about 311 reports. I believe they did get permission to, when they realized they weren't going to have that sample size, they went and got permission to use draft reports, but that dropped them to about 90 reports instead of 311.
Yeah, I show 79 plus 21, so is the numbers that I show. So, Mr. Runcie, let me tell you why I'm troubled by this. Let's put it in education terms. It's like a student is going through and taking an SAT, and we're getting certain trends, and then all of a sudden we don't like the trends we see, and we change the goalposts, we change the way that we do the methodology so that the SAT scores look a little bit better. Would you not agree that that's what the Department of Education has done?
We're a performance-based organization. We have an obligation to continue to refine and innovate and look at the
All right,
best
in the
practices.
24 seconds I have left, at what point will you start to comply with the OMB guidance on how we're to have a sample size with 300? At what point are you going to do
The
that?
methodology that we use has been approved by OMB.
Okay, that's your testimony. All right, here's what I would ask you to do is report back to this committee with OMB and see if they're in compliance, and I would ask the Inspector General and GAO to see if they concur with your decision, and I appreciate the patience of the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Meadows. Ms. Plaskett, you're recognized for 5 minutes. We are alternating between the education
thank
and
you.
oversight, so
Thank
it
you so
is
much,
it
Chair.
is your time.
I don't want to, mess up the protocol. Thank you so much. Ms. Teague, at the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, you testified that a company in Georgia, a subcontractor, refused to give your office access to information you needed. Is that correct? This was regarding a Federal Information Security Management Act?
That's correct.
Okay. And you testified that the name of the company that refused to give you that access was TSYS. Is that correct?
That's correct, TSYS.
And who's the prime contractor, since that appears to be?
Accenture.
Okay. And this is a government contract paid for by taxpayer funds to a subcontractor.
Yes.
And did you ask for TSYS for a copy of the contract? And if so, did they give it to you?
Well, there's many layers of issues. We asked for, after we did not get the complete information we needed to audit the system that they were operating, we asked FSA for a copy of the contract between Accenture and TSYS. They suggested that initially that we go directly to Accenture ourselves and get a copy of it. I personally thought it was FSA's responsibility because the subcontractor was operating their system and that they should go get a copy. They were not able to do that.
I mean, I know that it's, you want to go talk about the department, but this is a contractor and a subcontractor to the government.
Yes.
And don't they have a responsibility to give you that information when you ask for it? That's a yes or a no. Do they have a responsibility to give you that information?
Yes.
And so what is the mechanism that you have in place to ensure that they do that, rather than going to the department, but to get that information from the contractor?
Well, my mechanism when they don't supply information to me is to do a subpoena. I have
And
not
have you
done
done that?
I have not done that in this case yet, no.
Do you plan on doing that?
For the contract, I don't know. We have contemplated, I mean, my biggest concern was not the contract itself. My biggest concern is the information that we needed to do our vulnerability assessment of the mainframe on which the common origination and disbursement system rests in Columbus, Georgia, that we were not able to do because TSYS did not give us all the information we needed. That information I may yet subpoena.
But, I mean, I with a contractor or subcontractor to the government, the United States government, not giving the Inspector General information when they're asking for it. Mr. Rumsey, from the department's perspective, an obligation to give that information to the IG?
I believe so.
And when do you think the subpoena power should be enforced to make sure that that happens?
Yeah, that's not my call, but what I will say is that we tried everything that we could. I mean, I think we work with the Inspector General, the OCIO. We got the prime, we got the subcontractor, we had our contracting officer. We had a number of people exert a maximum amount of effort to get them to provide the information that the Inspector General wanted, and I was disappointed that we couldn't get.
So can the department withhold funds from not just the subcontract, but primarily the contractor, Accenture, until it complies with the requests of the Inspector General?
Our contract is with Accenture, and
Because they haven't given the information either, have they, Accenture?
well, it's not their information, it's the information that the subcontractor.
Well, the contract itself, right,
Yeah,
would be for Accenture.
Yes, but the contract, my understanding, based upon conversations with our contracting officer, is that is a commercial contract between Accenture and TSYS. We don't have the contractual right to get that contract.
What do you say to that, Ms. Teague?
I'd say that view is interesting in light of the fact that TSYS is in charge of operating one of the most significant data systems that FSA has.
Well, you know, I know that the chairman of Oversight and Government Reform, Mr. Chaffetz, yesterday talked about writing a letter to the subcontractor. I think that a letter also needs to probably be written to the contractor in this case.
I would agree.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Guthrie, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Appreciate that, and I appreciate you all being here. This is a timely subject to me. I have one child that just left college, one in college, and when we just did a college tour, and you sit there as they say, the cost of attendance, and you're saying, how do people do this? It is, it's very difficult, and it's something that I know we're involved in doing, and so I'm, since you're kind of peers, my age group, I have a lot of, that's what I hear a lot of parents talk about, the affordability of college. So it is on a lot of people's minds. A lot of that happens at the state level, I get it, but having an adequate and a good service program, and I can't go without pointing out, because I started talking about this in 2009, I'll still say it again, $10 billion of federal money that's paid by students back to the federal government, so the profit from operating the program goes to pay for the Affordable Care Act. So that's $1 billion, almost $1 billion a year goes to pay. So I just want to remind people that money that students pay for their colleges is diverted to the Affordable Care Act. So almost $10 billion over 10 years. That's over 10 years. So Mr. Runcie, I want to ask you a question. Throughout the GOA's testimony, there are numerous examples of FSA falling short in its management and oversight of servicing contracts. A major consequence of the oversight deficiencies is that borrowers in turn face inconsistent experiences and services. This is a far-reaching consequence that FSA, as a performance-based organization, is tasked with fixing. Keeping in mind that until these problems are rectified, borrowers will continue to lack the kind of service required by FSA's PBO designation. And I have a few questions based on that. When will the clear guidance to help servicers interpret income documentation be ready?
So I just want to give you some context in terms of why there may be some differences between, the servicers and how they, treat specific incidents, right? So we had to stand up the TIVAs, the 4 servicers, in a pretty short window, and we allowed them to use their commercial practices and their commercial, operations. And because of that, there are variations. And those servicers also provided those servicers to the FEL program. So there were inconsistencies there from a servicing perspective. But in order for us to quickly ramp up to deal with the volume that we did, we had to leverage their commercial operations. There were differences in some of their practices. Those differences still exist, and we provided guidance and clarification for some of those. But ultimately, we're entering into a recompete process that will start in January of 2016. And through that process, we're going to be able to do some things like standardize common practices, have common branding, and to address some of those issues.
Okay, it's understood. We had discussed it in this committee for a while, but it kind of just came into being because of the money needed to pay for the Affordable Care Act. So when will the guidance, so understand the problem, so when is it going to be fixed?
Well, first of all, some of the stuff has been, some of the things that we can address, we've addressed, like the capitalization of interest. Other things like over and underpayments that were mentioned before, we're working with CFPB. They're an organization that understands some of the issues around what's the best practices in terms of dealing with that. So, I don't have a specific time frame, but I would say within 2016, certainly.
Within 2016?
Yep.
And then also, the servicers expressed for a common manual, I think we talked about a little earlier in this tie, similar to those that exist with FEL in order to help solve consistency. Do you have plans to have a common manual, and when will that be ready?
Yeah, the common manual will be something that, based upon our recompete strategy, we'll be able to put together. However, the common manual that existed before, there were still differences between the way those servicers who used the common manual, addressed borrower issues. So I think the platform that the place we're looking to go is to be able to standardize a number of processes as we go through recompete process.
Is there a date that you think?
Well, the recompete process is going to start January 2016. That's our target. The contracts themselves wind down. The existing contracts today wind down in 2019, so there would be a transition period.
Okay, about to run out of time, but real quick, I have a bill that we've seen, particularly Indiana University, be extremely successful with financial accounting. So I have a plan to fix that problem under the current law. We're trying to change the law, but is there a plan to fix where we are under the current law?
Yeah, I mean, there are policy changes that can be made, but clearly, our exit counseling, it does make a huge difference. I think the multiples, you're 2 times less likely to miss a payment if you go through counseling, at least our counseling that we have in place. And so we have a lot of the tools. I'm not sure what the hit rate is in terms of, people actually using those tools, but it is a requirement.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Runcie, we've heard from a number of sources that the FAFSA form is so complicated that a significant number of people are not applying to college or not getting the aid to which they're entitled. There are a lot of suggestions in simplifying the form. One is using prior year taxes. Have you adopted that?
Yes, Congressman Scott. We have a project timeline and a plan, and we've allocated resources to have prior instituted by October of 2016. And that would be a tremendous opportunity to increase access and make it simpler and easier for people to complete the FAFSA.
Another recommendation was to have easier access to internal revenue information. Have you adopted that policy?
Yes, I mean, we have, the income, we have the DRT tool, which is the data retrieval tool that allows for automatic retrieval of the tax information right into your FAFSA form, as well as for income-based repayment. For those repayment plans, you can also leverage the automatic IRS tool.
So that's available now?
Yes, that is available now.
What about if you are eligible for a means-tested program, is that using that recommendation?
I'm sorry, for what tested?
Means-tested, like food stamps or other kinds of income-based program. If you're eligible for those programs, that you would have a simplified FAFSA form?
I'm not sure on that. I'm going to have to come back to you on that, Congressman Scott.
Are there any additional changes that you will be recommending that might need congressional action?
Not at this time. I think we're just really focused on making sure that we can hit the prior and have, and then move the FAFSA form from January to October. Historically, the FAFSA form has been available in January. This is a tremendous change because while you're applying for school in the fall, you can now know how much you're eligible to get in terms of financial aid. That's going to make a lot of difference in terms of people having an understanding that they can actually be able to go to college. So that's a huge step.
We had a question about allocation of payments when a person has multiple loans. How are those allocated in terms of whether or not the payment goes to those loans with higher interest rates?
Yeah, so that's where there has been some flexibility, and that's the issue that we're working on with CFPB and other agencies who have expertise in terms of what would be the best practices for borrowers. So that is an issue that we're focused on, and we're going to address, as soon as we establish what the best practices are and make that commonplace across.
Are there any efforts to participate in outreach to maximize the number of students applying for financial aid, or to inform students of various repayment plans rather than just react to their applications?
Yeah, so we have targeted outreach campaigns. So we do emailing. We have a lot of social media, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. So we leverage that infrastructure to provide as much information about our repayment plans as possible. In terms of the front end, in terms of the take-up in FAFSA, we have a FAFSA completion project and a FAFSA completion tool that we've used to create more FAFSA filers, a greater percentage of high school seniors filing FAFSAs, which is an indication as to whether you will enroll in college.
Are there any, in terms of efficiency, are there any investments that you need to make in terms of equipment or software that would help you become more efficient that you don't have funding for?
I mean, I think, well, we're in the process of establishing enterprise data warehouse, which is one of the things that we're trying to leverage, create an infrastructure where we can use more data to have more predictive analysis, as well as to look at how we can improve ourselves operationally. Also, from a program compliance standpoint, we would be able to leverage some of that data to find out where there's more risk. I think our issue is the entire infrastructure needs to grow. And in order to be able to grow the infrastructure and have the type of security and some of the other things that we need, we're going to need additional resources. I saw the budget, the Senate and the House budget. I don't know if it's appropriate to bring that up, but with that shortfall, there may be certain things that we will not be able to deliver.
If you could give us that details on what you could not deliver without the money, that'd be helpful.
Okay, terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Mr. Wahlberg, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you to the panel for being here. Mr. Runcie, when was the last time FSA released a performance plan?
We released our strategic plan. I believe it was updated. I believe we released it. If it has, it will be released within the next month.
Before that, when was the last plan released?
We update our strategic plan every year. Every few years, we have what we call a full strategic plan where we solicit market information. We talk to.
But when was the last plan that was introduced? Because I understand it's supposed to be every 5 years, correct?
Yeah.
When was the last plan?
The last plan, I think we just issued one within the next month. I think we're issuing a plan, and before that, we issued a plan in 2012. So in 2012, we issued a strategic.
It wasn't 2010. When it was supposed to be back in 2010, it wasn't released until 2012.
I know in 2012 we released a plan. I'll have to get you that information. I want to be precise, but
I'd appreciate that. Who did you consult with when creating these plans?
Well, what we do is we do a bunch of market research, we do environmental scans, and then there is a 30-day notice period where we send out the plan so stakeholders can provide comment on the plan. And that's why I'm a little bit confused, because I know we sent a plan out, I believe, September of this year with a 30-day notice period so that we could get comments back on the plan. And we've done that historically, and we've gotten comments. I don't believe this year we got a single comment.
Who would you normally consult with?
Stakeholders that represent, student groups, so student associations, school associations, the Hill. So we would send that out to those stakeholders.
Mr. Draeger, when did the FSA consult you about its 2015 plan?
The last time that we were consulted by FSA was in 2012, where we highlighted for them the participation agreement delays, the delays in closing out program reviews, delays in guidance.
So that was 2012?
Correct.
Not presently for the 2015 plan.
We continue to raise the issue, but outside the context of an update to their plan.
In your experience, has FSA consistently consulted with schools, with leaders, with students, and other stakeholders prior to implementing a new plan?
That has not been our experience, and we have not heard from schools that have been consulted directly either.
Mr. Runcie, then, by statute, you're required to consult interested parties prior to implementing a new plan. Did you consult NASFA? And I guess, would you say NASFA is an interested party?
Well, my records, which I checked before I came here, indicate that we sent a notice to Justin Draeger, who is the head of NASFA. So it was sent to him this year.
Well, we got a conflict here. So if you could supply us with accurate information as to that letter
We will supply that to you.
We'd appreciate that, because Justin is shaking his head saying he's not received that letter.
I understand that, and I will provide you the information.
Mr. Drager, in your testimony, you discuss how the working relationship between schools and FSA has become so strenuous that it's ultimately hurting students. Can you elaborate a bit more and discuss potential solutions?
Yeah, I think one of the starkest examples has been the delays in the Department of Education in getting to schools all sorts of guidance, which we've highlighted in our GE reporting example. Closing out program reviews, we have an instance where a large public four-year school submitted all documents for a program review in October 2012. It wasn't until May 2015 that they were informed that their documents were being reviewed. So we have significant time frames where basically these program reviews aren't being closed out. It's perpetually hanging over the heads of these schools, and no entity, public or private, can operate with that level of uncertainty.
What recourse do they have if they're having problems in getting action from FSA, and I guess who can they appeal to as well?
Yeah, the structure of FSA is such that there really is no appeal for the school. FSA provides all the guidance, they do all the program reviews, they make the determination about who can and can't participate in the Title IV program.
So it's a black hole. If it doesn't work for them, ultimately they have no recourse.
We're not familiar with any benchmarks that are published. There's no recourse beyond going back to the same entity that you've been trying to work with.
My time has expired. Thank you for your testimony.
So is it possible for me to address that with some statistics?
I'm sorry,
Oh, I'm sorry.
but the time is up. Ms. Maloney.
I first would like to give him the time to address this.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. So there may be anecdotes, but what I have is a folder of facts. I have the statistics on the cycle time for all our program reviews, our recertification applications, and so I'll just give you an example of why that it's important to look at the facts. So let me put it this way. So there was a 72% decrease in our cycle time, the days to conduct a program review between 2011 and 2015. Last year, the program review, we did 291 program reviews, and the average processing time was 249 days. And as I mentioned, that was a significant reduction. If you look at the recertification applications, which are another point of contact with the schools, those are down significantly as well over the years. If you look at the approval applications, double-digit % reductions in the response time. So when you're looking at hundreds of actions, and if you look at the totality of it, there are about 2,000 interactions with the schools. All of those cycle times have been down significantly over the last 4 years. We can provide you with the information. So this anecdotal information about our performance is just not accurate.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to be associated with the comments of Dr. Fox in support of our friend Ruben Hinojosa and express my gratitude for his leadership and friendship. We've had the opportunity to serve together on the Financial Services Committee, where he served with great distinction, as he did in the overall body for his district. We will miss you, and I'm sad you're leaving. I have a series of questions on the principles on student loan servicing. I understand others have expressed interest in it, and if I don't have the chance to finish, I'd like to place them in the record for a response later. Mr. Renzi, according to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, student loan debt is now at $1.2 trillion and is now second only to mortgage debt. It is now even higher than credit card debt, which is staggering. So this is really incredible to see this type of large consumer debt growing in our country. And earlier this year, the Department of Education joined the CFPB and the Department of the Treasury in soliciting information about student loan servicing from the public. And one key complaint raised by numerous respondents was, and I quote, "Servicers of both private and federal student loans may not inform borrowers experiencing financial hardship about available alternative repayment plans," end quote. We need to address this and end this and make sure students know all their alternatives. And how does your office examine whether servicers are providing repayment information to borrowers that is complete accurate, timely, and also includes alternatives?
Yeah, so, and we have to, and I agree with some of the findings that were mentioned today. We monitor calls, but we could do that more efficiently and have more consequences around the call monitoring that we do. As I mentioned before, in October of 2014, we changed the structure, so there's a tremendous incentive on the part of the servicers to make sure that they inform borrowers of all their repayment plans so that they could stay current on their obligations. That was, so we're still in the process of seeing the impact of that pricing change, but we're committed to making sure that we adjust that model to make sure that we have the proper incentives in place so that servicers will provide all the information they can about the repayment plans. Separate from that, we're doing our part in terms of our outreach, our communication, and leveraging our websites and so forth.
Okay, how much of loan servicers' compensation is currently based on achieving specific customer service standards?
Well, we have surveys. So there's a customer survey that is a component that's used, and based upon how they perform, when we blend the customer survey along with some of the other components, for instance, the percentage of loans that are in current repayment and certain other attributes. We look at that, but we also look at the survey results to see how they're performing from a customer perspective, and that determines their allocation, which determines their economics. So we do use that as a part of our model.
Okay, my time has expired. Thank you, and I place the rest of my questions into the record to be answered. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Maloney. Ms. Stefanik, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I represent a number of higher education institutions in northern New York, ranging from SUNY schools to community college to private colleges, and I visited every single one of them. And one of the conversations that I frequently have with students is that student aid programs are complex and challenging for them to understand. And my question is for Mr. Runcie. One of the statutory purposes of the federal student aid PBO is to make aid programs more understandable for students and their families. However, just last month, GAO released a report that found many eligible borrowers aren't even aware of income-driven repayment plans and therefore aren't able to make the decision to lower their payments and reduce the risk of defaulting on their loans. How are you addressing this failure, and how are you educating servicers to make sure they can accurately explain this maze of repayment options to borrowers so they can access the help they need to repay these loans?
Yes, I mean, part of it is the overall complexity of the student loan program. So there's a lot of statutory programs, certain things that we don't have control over, so it makes it much more difficult to make a decision about what the right repayment plan is. In terms of income-driven repayment, we put out a targeted campaign that yielded pretty impressive results. We are doing another targeted campaign once we come out with Repay. Repay is an income-driven program that's going to expand the available universe of people that can participate in income-based repayment by another 5 million. So on the heels of that, we're going to make sure that we send out a targeted email campaign. We've worked with other parties, as I mentioned before, Treasury in terms of the income tax process. We've worked with Intuit in the past. So we're going to leverage partners in our own infrastructure and the servicers as well, because as I mentioned before, we changed the pricing model there. So there are lots of things we have done and that we plan to do, but I think what's most important is that since we started taking these actions, you can see the significant increase in the adoption of income-based repayment. So while there may be some folks that aren't aware, our hope is as we continue to roll out our communications plan and our information, we will shrink the universe of people who aren't aware. But I think we're continuing to push on that, on that front, and we've made some tremendous, I think, progress.
Well, I agree with you. Students have to be made aware of this, and this is a generational crisis that we are facing here with historic amount of student debt. And as a millennial myself, this is pushing off our next generation of leaders from buying their first home, from being able to save for the future. So I suggest we fix this program so that our young people are able to make good decisions and not default on their student loans. My next question is for Mr. Drager. In your testimony, you talked about the importance of accountability, and the lack of accountability, which is a key part of a PBO, tremendously erodes the goodwill between institutions and FSA, and you referenced reporting requirements. Besides the gainful employment reporting disaster that you referenced in your testimony, have there been other instances where unclear guidance or poor communication made it challenging for schools to do their jobs?
There have been several examples where schools have tried to seek guidance from the Department of Education as deadlines loomed, whether it's with reporting requirements dealing with subsidized Stafford loan limitations, which went into effect in the last year. The interesting, I'm also dealing in facts. We have 20% of our schools have reported operational shortfalls. That's a real number, 20% representing 6.5 million students where they cannot do their jobs because of the operational shortfalls that I've cited in my testimony. The accountability thing, to me, is most acute when you look at its last annual report, where they acknowledge that they failed to achieve 2 out of 13 of their strategic objectives, dealing with customer service to schools, customer service to students. But then in the very next paragraph, they detailed those failures as successes. They said, quote, "Given the volume of new requirements over the past year, the small reduction in these scores on this metric is an indication of the success of FSA's outreach and support efforts. The problem with self-assessment is even when the department fails, they deem it a success."
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the leadership of both subcommittees for this hearing, and I want to thank the witnesses as well. I spent 40 years in the classroom at Bennett College in Greensboro, so higher education is a tremendous interest of mine. So let me just piggyback on the last question about default, and because institutions are penalized as well, in addition to the students and the things that they can do when they leave. So let me ask Ms. Emery Aris, do you believe that our institutions of higher education should play a role in better counseling students on these programs, or should it be up to Congress and the administration to increase the participation in the programs? And if so, what should they look like?
We haven't looked specifically at the role of schools. However, we have looked at the role of servicers and the department in educating borrowers about repayment options. And while I agree with Mr. Runcie that the take-up rate has increased in terms of income-based repayment options, there's still a very wide gap between those that are eligible and those that in fact participate. And part of the challenge is that although there are in fact targeted campaigns, as Mr. Runcie mentioned, there is not an across-the-board notice to people when they enter repayment about these options, so that simply telling people when they start repaying what the options are is not happening across the board, and that needs to be done.
Thank you. Mr. Runcie, if you could, what's your response to the institutions of higher education and their role?
Yeah, well, in terms of the, I'm sorry. So, yes, you know, the institutions, there is exit counseling, and some institutions do a pretty fabulous job in terms of exit counseling, where they make sure that the students understand the obligations and the consequences of defaulting. You know, we also obviously, you know, are involved from a servicing standpoint. We reach out and we provide information. If you look at the cohort default rates for all schools, whether they're proprietary schools or private schools or HBCUs, those cohort default rates have all dropped about 20% within the last two cohorts, which is a tremendous reduction. So whether it's the schools or the Department of Education, there has been a noticeable impact in terms of the reduction in the cohort default rates.
Okay, sounds like both should be involved. But Mr. Miller, since the 2008 economic downturn, many states have made significant cuts in funding for higher education. In North Carolina, our General Assembly, and I was a part of that at one time, and our governor have made gutting higher education a regular activity. I didn't support that. But in my hometown of Greensboro, the University of North Carolina at Greensboro has eliminated, for example, 390 class sections, or about 6% of its course offerings, to offset a $4 million budget cut. So can you speak to the effect of state disinvestment on increased college tuition costs and greater student loan debt, especially for low-income students?
Essentially what we're seeing in this country now is a great cost shift, where it used to be that states viewed public higher education as a public good they should be subsidizing and making affordable for all students. That is increasingly not the case. Essentially what's happening is that institutions such as the one as you described, their cost of providing the education is not really growing, and they're probably keeping it level. Instead, all that's happening is the state is pulling money out and asking students to make up the difference themselves. And the effect of this essentially is you're making students borrow, and even worse, you're increasing the risk of trying college for low-income people. To get back to your question about default rates, essentially this is what we're seeing, that a lot of our defaults are coming from borrowers who try college for maybe a semester or two and they drop out. A study from the Association of Community College Trustees found that most borrowers in default from Iowa community colleges owed a little bit under $5,000. And so essentially what we've done is we've slashed state funding, raised tuition, made college almost like a lottery ticket for students, where if they graduate, they'll probably repay, and if they drop out, they will find themselves in dire financial straits.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I'm about out of time, Madam Chair. You're back.
Thank you. Mr. Carter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for being here. Ms. Tyne, let me start with you, if I could. You're the Inspector General of the Department of Education. How many investigations do you conduct on FSA?
We do a number of investigations related to the programs and operations of FSA, but as far as FSA employees, not that many.
Okay, I'm more concerned about the operations than I am.
I don't have the numbers, and I can get back to you on specifics, but it's a good part. We do annually about 250 to 300 investigations we have open. I imagine probably over half of those relate to FSA programs and operations. That's my guess, and I will be happy to give you specific numbers later.
Okay, it's my understanding that there are 4 different areas that FSA is obligated to. Do you know if they're meeting their obligations in those 4 areas that are outlined in the statutes?
Well, I mean, I think we have, as I've testified, concerns over, particularly over their management, their oversight of the various participants in their programs, and also in the management of their regular day-to-day activities. As far as the program participants, where we see our greatest risk of fraud, one of the areas we've highlighted in the last few years is our still growing problem of fraud rings. These are fake students who prey upon our distance education programs, and particularly in our low-cost community colleges, pretending to be students signing up for classes and getting disbursements of federal student aid. We did a report to FSA a few years ago with a number of recommendations that FSA do some system enhancements and other things to address this problem. FSA has taken some steps, but we're still seeing the problem grow.
Okay, what can we do? What can we do in this committee? What can we do in Congress to help you with that?
I think one of the areas that actually is within your all's responsibility, one of the issues that drives the costs are the cost of attendance. I think there's a statutory requirements related to that. We need to be looking at the difference. Is all the money that you need when you go to a brick and mortar school and you have to have room and board, the same that you need if you already have a job and a house and you're doing an online program from home? Do you need the same amount of money dispersed to you? Because if we can reduce the amount of money that goes out that is not needed, first of all, you reduce the debt, but you also reduce the effectiveness of the programs for fraudsters.
Okay. Mr. Runcie, let me ask you, it appears that a lot of the problems that we see in the student loan industry is being laid at the blame is being laid on the servicers. But aren't you in charge of the servicers? I mean, don't you have direct responsibility for that?
Certainly I have, and we have direct responsibility for that. But again, what we're talking about are a number of findings and their issues that we continue to address. And we've done, and I think throughout the course of this testimony, I've highlighted some things that we've done to address that.
But it seems to me all I'm seeing here is finger pointing. And look, this is a serious problem. Now, unlike my colleague, I'm not a millennial, but I'm an employer, and I see students coming out. I'm a pharmacist, and I see pharmacy students coming out with $150,000, $200,000 in student debt. And I see them coming out, and they tell me, well, my goal is to have it paid off in 6 years. 6 years. And that's good if they can do that. But can you imagine? I mean, what are we doing? What are we doing to help with this situation?
Well, Congressman Carter, I think the overall statutory environment, there are statutory limits, and some of those limits are high. We don't control some of the policies that allow for students to get the types of debt that they sometimes incur. What we've tried to do is, through GE, CDRs, and other accountability metrics, make sure that institutions don't prey upon students by loading them up with debt with no ability to get a job that could manage those debts.
And I understand that, but I'm a little bit frustrated by the finger pointing here, I'll tell you. Ultimately, the responsibility lies with you guys, and you have to make sure that the servicers are doing their part.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. Mr. Clay, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here today. This year, President Obama issued an executive order that sets forth a student aid bill of rights. This included specific directives to agencies to increase protections for student loan borrowers. Mr. Runcie, can you briefly describe the specific rights the administration believes students should have?
Yeah, so some of the principles, making sure that students have access to financial aid, that they are not harmed, and that we give them the tools to make sure that they can repay their obligations. Those are some of the general points. But under that, there were certain specifics around making sure that there's common branding, that students can make complaints. So we're putting together a comprehensive complaint system. So if students and borrowers have complaints, we can log them, we can track them, and we can be responsive and use those to make sure that we make changes to benefit students and borrowers. So there's a litany of different things that are in there. A lot of those will be probably addressed as we go through our recompete process and through some of the outreach that we plan on doing. Another thing was sort of transparency and providing awareness. And we've already had some targeted email campaigns with notifications to students and borrowers. So we're looking to get more information out to them so that they can make better decisions.
And the administration has also proposed critical improvements to federal student aid that require statutory changes, and that means it's up to Congress to act. For example, the administration has proposed eliminating the tax liability for certain discharged student debt. Mr. Runcie, can you tell us why this proposal is important?
It's important because, if we eliminate, depending on how much debt we're talking about, it could be a substantial burden, economic burden. So, let's say, for instance, someone had a situation where they were falsely misled, took out loans, and eventually those loans were discharged. It would be to accept that someone would get a large tax bill, after the fact. And so, it's important so that we can actually produce a real make-whole. It wouldn't be a real make-whole if you had a large tax obligation at the end.
And statutory changes are required to implement.
Yes, that's right.
Proposal, and Congress has not enacted these changes yet, have they?
Not as far as I know.
And the administration has also proposed statutory changes to create stronger protections for students and borrowers from the predatory practices of some student loan assistance companies. For example, some firms charge high fees for services that students can access for free from government websites. And Mr. Runcie, Congress has not enacted these proposed changes to protect borrowers from such predatory practices, has it?
No.
And so we must act too, and protect these borrowers from some of these practices. And I listened to my colleague, Mr. Carter, talk about what you all are doing, but I also realize too that at the state level, budgets are strained, state budgets are strained, which means less money for these colleges, and it also means that they have to raise fees in order to sustain. And does anyone on the panel have any opinions about the actual cost of going to school now, and what maybe we can do to kind of tamp that down? Mr. Miller?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's the biggest problem, is that by the time FSA gets to the borrower, they've already picked up the loan, and the underlying conditions have already occurred to put them in a bad spot. I mean, I think our biggest problem is right now the federal government is handing out a lot of dollars, and it's doing its part to help support higher education. It doesn't demand anything from states or institutions about what it does. And so it says it's okay to a state to say, we're going to slash all our money and charge a maximum Pell recipient, the lowest income person in college, thousands of dollars. There are single moms out there who might be walking away with $57,000 in loan debt because there's nothing from the federal government to ask that schools, institutions, and states do their part. And it's a problem. The federal government cannot unilaterally achieve affordability.
And the ultimate impact is that it puts college out of reach for low and moderate income students.
Correct. It puts it out of reach, and it also makes it much riskier for the people who try it and it doesn't work out.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Curbelo, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I thank both the committee chairman and all the witnesses for this wonderful opportunity to discuss this important issue. I'll just say briefly before my questions that we must do more to make sure that young people have all of the information they need to make rational choices before taking out a loan, before making a decision on what their path in higher ed should be. I get calls and I have encounters all the time with young people who are frustrated by this system and who are, quite frankly, trapped in this system. Ms. Emery Arras, I want to ask you, your testimony mentions FSA has not clarified how services should apply overpayments and underpayments, servicers, overpayments and underpayments to student loan balances, and FSA is now working with CFPB to establish a consistent approach to disseminate to servicers. But last month, CFPB released a report saying servicers are not appropriately applying underpayments. Where do you see FSA's responsibility for ensuring payments are applied correctly?
We believe that FSA needs to instruct servicers on how to officially apply underpayments and overpayments. They're operating in a vacuum right now. Some do it one way, some do it another way, and borrowers are treated differently. So we think the responsibility lies on FSA to come up with consistent guidance to have it be one single program.
Mr. Runcie, would you like to respond to that?
I agree with that, and what we want to do is, if we're going to make it uniform and create a standard, we want to make sure that we have the best practices and the best information, so we're working to make sure we get it right when we put it out there.
Thank you. And Mr. Runcie, I want to ask you about heightened cash monitoring. Could you discuss briefly what the standards are for putting institutions under this type of program, either HCM1 or HCM2, and also what institutions can do to be removed from this status once it's been applied by the department?
Yeah, it varies. They're put on for a number of reasons, but ultimately, there's an issue that needs to be resolved, or potentially, students and the federal taxpayer may need to be protected. So it gives us an additional enrollment and cash flows and things like that.
But what specifically can trigger that decision to go into an HCM1 or an HCM2?
It could be something for instance, maybe there's a delay with their financial statements. There's an issue with issuing their financial statements that would trigger, putting them on, heightened cash monitoring. It could be something in a program review that comes out that we, about the way they deal with, return of Title IV. It could be a number of different things, and once it's triggered, there's a heightened cash monitoring.
So it's probably fair to say that the department has fairly broad discretion in terms of when to apply heightened cash management.
I think that's right.
Okay. By the way, Mr. Runcie, I'm not sure if you're aware, but there's an education leader by your last name in South Florida who is very well regarded in that community.
I won't disassociate my...
Thank you very much for being here today. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Courtney, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Draeger, again, I always appreciate hearing your input. Your folks on the ground, are really right there at the front trenches, sort of dealing with this crisis of higher ed affordability, and the input, I think, is always really appreciated. I want to, again, just sort of underscore one point that you made, which is that the FSA actually did a very good job in terms of implementing the direct student loan program, and I don't think that, for those who maybe don't follow this stuff like a box score like some of us, I mean, that was a huge transformation of the student loan program where, again, we eliminated the loan origination wasteful spending that existed in the old system. And as Mr. Miller pointed out, the savings that was generated for that, we were able to plow back into Pell to the tune of about, I think it was $36 or $38 billion. And they actually did a pretty good job in terms of making that work. And, I would just note that that didn't happen, though, just because of FSA. It's because Congress acted. We passed the Student Aid and Fiscal Responsibility Act as part of the budget reconciliation process with the Affordable Care Act. But we have to be a partner in terms of trying to help solve this problem. The overhang of $1 trillion of student loan debt, which is being carried by college graduates right now, is something that Congress can actually do something. When you look at the interest rates, these legacy loans that were written 10 years ago, 15 years ago in terms of the private student loans, and compare them to what's out there for consumer credit in terms of 30-year mortgages or credit cards, I mean, it's outrageous that people are still repaying loans at 6, 7, 8, sometimes 9 and 10%. In the low-interest environment that we're in today. I just checked for SNCS this morning. The Treasury yield rate is 2.16%. So the government is only charging or paying 2.16% to borrow, but it's still receiving student government loans, public loans, at a far higher interest rate. We have a bill, H.R. 1484, the Bank on Students Emergency Student Loan Act, which would allow people to refinance down their high interest rate loans to 3.8%. We have 181 co-sponsors in the House, and yet the majority just refuses to move forward on this measure. And yes, there will be a loss of revenue to the government in terms of allowing people to pay a lower rate of interest than what they're paying right now. But I would argue that the purpose of the Stafford Student Loan Program was not to generate revenue to the federal government. And frankly, that's what the powers that be in the House are clinging to, and that's why this bill so far, in any case, has not moved forward. But it is, CBO has told us that it will save conservatively about $50 to $60 billion in repayment costs to people who are carrying these high-interest loans. And the Pew Research Institute showed us the damage that that's doing to America's society. People are delaying getting married, they're delaying having kids, they're delaying buying houses because they're carrying these high-interest rate loans, which again, in every other sector of the economy, people can write down those kinds of rates. We do it with home mortgages, we do it with even credit cards, and yet people are trapped in student loans. And Congress, frankly, has the key to open the door to fix that. So, in any case, I'm going to get off my soapbox here a little bit because, again, I appreciate those comments on the direct student loan program. On gainful employment, I just want to make sure I understood. You seem to suggest that after that back and forth, which sounded pretty rough, that you sort of have found some equilibrium in terms of the reporting requirements?
Schools were finally given a tool 10 weeks after the reporting deadline that allowed them to see whether there were any additional conflicting data. So after some of the back and forth with the department, threats of administrative capability, schools were eventually given the tool to figure out whether they were in compliance.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And again, I feel your pain because I know that was probably pretty onerous. But again, I would just sort of say from this side of the witness table, when we're talking about Title IV, which is I think 128 billion was the number that was tossed out there every year. I mean, frankly, I think the taxpayers should know that it is being used in a productive manner. And the gainful employment rules, in my opinion, are just frankly responsible governance in terms of saying that people who get benefit from this, which are some of these higher ed institutions that are in the headlines today, they shouldn't be part of the program. And the only way we're going to learn that is by having measurements, accountability, which the gainful employment program was designed to do. So I thank your members for their persistence in terms of working that issue through. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Connolly, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for being so gracious. Mr. Runcie, you're aware of the fact we had a hearing yesterday on especially the deployment or lack thereof of IT in the Department of Education, especially with respect to student loans.
Yes, sir.
And part of Ms. Tye's testimony involved the fact that some contractors, subcontractors with the department did not allow her office access because they were afraid, given the fact that they had private clients as well as Department of Education clients, that the one could compromise the other. Well, okay, but we've got to be worried about the fact that a lot of our data involving the public sector is in their hands, and the IG has to have access to it, and frankly, so do you. Have you looked into that issue?
Yes, I was very much a part of that process. We did all...
You don't mean by that preventing Ms. Tye from access?
No. Facilitating, trying to facilitate
right.
the process. As a matter of fact, Ms. Tye, myself, the Department OCIO, the prime, the subcontractor, our contracting officer, we put a maximum amount of effort and pressure on both the prime and the subcontractor to get access to the information that the Inspector General required. Ultimately, we didn't have a contractual mechanism to get, I guess in this particular track, between the prime and the sub. There were other comprehensive nature of the user IDs that were provided or were not provided. So, at the end of the day, I was just as disappointed as I think the Inspector General was, but we didn't have a vehicle to make them provide us the information.
Well, let me just say there needs to be a contractual vehicle. I'm sorry, Ms. Tye.
Yes, I think the vehicle is a contractual vehicle that would allow audit access. I mean, the real part of the problem, maybe even more than our access, is the department or FSA has a contract, a contractor operating a major system, and it has absolutely no visibility onto the IT security of that system. I mean,
I think that's
the problem.
You're absolutely right, Ms. Tye, and that's the problem, Mr. Runcie. God forbid, but the data on 58 million folks who have student loans or had student loans, let's in theory say in the hands of the private sector, and they don't allow us access to it, and that gets compromised, you know, that's more than an uncomfortable position for you and your colleagues. And so that's why this is important. It's not just something nice to do or following protocol. It's essential if we're going to ensure that we have security with respect to that, our database. So I think that's got to be addressed. One final question. What came up yesterday was the history of why FSA is a PBO. Because we had a lot of frustration of why can't you access this and why can't you access that for the CIO? Well, because Congress by statute created FSA as a PBO. Are we going to take a fresh look at that as to whether that still makes sense? That's 1997 legislation. And Madam Chairman, once Mr. Runcie answers, I will, as promised, yield back.
So the FITARA and the PBO, they're not mutually exclusive, right? So the department level OCIO can have visibility, a level of control, and you know, be a part of the investment management and project management process that we have for our IT infrastructure. We have worked with the department CIO and put together a plan that was submitted to OMB where he would have exactly that. I'm not sure what the status is, but my understanding is it's close to being approved. That will not undermine our flexibility as a PBO. I think as a PBO, given all the changes, both regulatory, statutory, and administrative initiatives, we need the flexibility to be able to respond to all those changes within short windows. But it does not exclude FITARA.
It better not.
I hear you loud and clear.
Gentleman yields back.
I do.
Thank you. It is now my turn. And as I indicated at the beginning of this to a couple of our witnesses, there's so much that we need to get out and so little time. Mr. Runcie, I just want to be clear on something that has been said and alluded to. Ms. Tai indicated that one of the things that can be done is that we not allow students to borrow more money than they actually need for their college. However, it's my understanding that institutions aren't allowed to stop students from borrowing money they don't need. And if they try to stop them or take too much time trying to counsel them, the school hears about it from you and tells them to stop doing that. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, there are statutory limits and what the student is eligible for. You know, there is an eligibility amount that they receive, and if they want to, my understanding is if they want to use that full amount, you know, in most cases, they will have access to it. There is this concept of professional judgment, but that's very specific, and it doesn't address the issue that the institutions face. But we're constrained within our regulatory framework.
Well, I've heard this from financial aid folks myself, that they feel very constrained to be able to give that advice to students. Mr. Drager, in your testimony, you discussed the troubling rollout of gainful employment reporting requirements and how schools did not have the necessary guidance in order to properly report their data. Even though FSA acknowledged they didn't deliver guidance in an appropriate time frame, they did not provide any deadline extensions to schools trying to catch up. You said schools are now starting to get responses, but do you have any explanation for why they haven't until now? Have they all heard back and been removed from a limbo not of their own making?
It's after letters have gone out to these schools accusing them of noncompliance, even though it looked to be just data. Widespread communication has gone back from FSA to schools, letting them know that everything is in the clear. I understand that as of last night, some communications were going back out to these schools saying that they had satisfied the data conflict requirements.
You think the fact that we were having this hearing today might have had anything to do with the fact that they got an answer last night at 7 p.m.?
I think it makes a strong case that accountability is needed outside of FSA's own self-assessments.
Well, I would tend to agree with you. Mr. Runcie, the FSA is charged with enforcing reporting requirements and timely monitoring of institutions. You say that you have facts, and we're just looking at isolated incidents. But there's one case where you took 7 years to complete a program review for which no fines were imposed for an additional 2 years. Then you imposed a fine of $10,000 for a mistake by a school in categorizing a burglary as a larceny. Based on these examples alone, it's clear to me that it's unacceptable for an organization that has such vast responsibility to make such arbitrary decisions. I have some questions I'm going to submit to you because we have so little time today, and I will be expecting a very prompt response from you. But I think that based on the 35 outstanding recommendations from the IG, multiple findings of deficiencies by GAO, combined with the egregious insufficiencies we've heard today, I'm extremely concerned about FSA's ability to serve students, borrowers, and taxpayers well. And you have been given the high honor, in my opinion, of being a performance-based organization, and you have not lived up to that right that has been given to you. And I would suggest to you that if you come to us and say you need more money to grow your infrastructure, that before you ask for more money, you'd better show this Congress that you have made some progress in straightening out your operation. Because we expect students, you also said there have been no negative impact to students and families, and comment after comment after comment in this room and in reports have shown negative impact. You get my ire up and the ire of a lot of members when you start messing with our constituents. Thank you. I yield. Mr. Jeffries, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Runcie, you testified earlier today, I believe, that there were approximately $2 billion in improper financial aid payments. Is that correct?
Yeah, the improper payment calculation yielded about $2 billion, but there weren't $2 billion in payments. It was an estimation.
And is that an estimation on an annual basis, or is that an aggregate?
That's an annual basis, or it was for 2015.
And can you explain the general nature of these improper payments or improper allocations?
Yeah, so first of all, a third of the improper payments could be underpayments as well. So it's just that it's not accurate, right? So for instance, you know, if the information that was put in a FAFSA form was wrong, and so a student received more or less, you know, in a financial package, that would be considered an improper payment, right? So there are instances like that, and so and when we use a methodology to try to figure out how much of that is out there, we come up with the $2 billion.
Now, what, if any, corrective actions have you taken to sort of address this improper payment situation?
Well, we've taken some of the recommendations from the IG and GAO in terms of putting in systems edits. We have verification procedures that we've put out there. So there have been a number of things that have helped. The income, the IRS data retrieval has increased our ability to address improper payments because there's less error for inaccuracy, less room for inaccuracy. So there are some things that we have done to try to address that.
Now, Ms. Tai, you noted in your testimony, I believe, that there was an increasing risk of people attempting to fraudulently obtain federal student aid in the context of distance education programs. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And a distance education program would be one where activity is conducted either exclusively or primarily over the Internet. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And in your view, what makes these particular programs susceptible to an increased risk of fraud?
Well, because all the transactions are done online, and so you don't know that the person who has signed up for classes and applied for federal student aid is intending. They can misrepresent income, they can misrepresent their identity, they can misrepresent their graduation status from high school, and there's really no way to check that unless you go through some other more unusual verification processes with the students. But you have the ability, fraudsters do, of either borrowing or stealing identities, signing up for class, applying for federal student aid, getting disbursements of aid, and then walking away.
Are there any steps that you would recommend that Congress take or consider in combating this fraud problem?
I think a couple of recommendations I would address to you. One I talked about earlier, which relates to cost of attendance. Do we need to have the same amount of money dispersed in distance ed programs, which typically are, working parents sitting at home, already own a house, and you're not attending a brick and mortar school? Costs may be different. The second is, do we need to disperse the money at the beginning of a semester or term all at once? Can we do it over the course of a semester or some other term? And that makes the fraud less likely to happen if there's less money up front to get.
And lastly, I think you also expressed concern with the sort of sudden school closure phenomenon. Is that right?
Yeah, we did an inspection a few years ago to look at essentially at FSA's readiness to deal with school closures.
And what, if any, steps, I guess the Corinthian College example would be a prominent case of the consequences of a sudden school closure, both on the student side and on the taxpayer side. Is there anything that you would recommend that Congress do in strengthening our ability to address this situation?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think FSA, our inspections certainly pointed to some areas that they needed to work on. They had a group sort of that I think Mr. Runcie mentioned, this publicly traded large school working group that was supposed to be keeping abreast of these issues. It hadn't met in the 3 years before it was created, and then didn't meet regularly for 3 years. They need to do a better job of gathering financial information, and particularly from outside sources, not just within FSA. I think for Congress, I'd have to think about that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hinojosa, you are recognized for any brief closing comments you'd like to make.
Thank you very much, Chairman Fox. I want to make a statement and then a closing remark. The congressional intent was for FSA to use best business practices, and the members of both of these committees have intended to listen and learn to see how we can address the poor performance of servicers. And being that the servicers failed in their performance, why didn't FSA replace the prime contractor, Accenture, and the subcontractor, I believe it's pronounced Thesis? I am going to respectfully request, that Mr. Rumsey and Mrs. Tai give members of these two committees in writing within 30 days why the servicers' contracts were not canceled and new servicers given the federal contract, just like we do in business. I was president of a large company, and I remember having contracts with the Department of Defense to supply food for them, and many who did not meet the requirements, and a new provider given the contract. It seems to me that something as big as what we're talking about here with $1 trillion in debt and the amounts that were taken by the savings of getting rid of the middleman that were the lenders of student college loans and replaced by the federal government, where I, as chairman, was told that over a 10-year period, we'd save $96 billion, and with that, we took a part and put it into Pell Grants. It seems to me that that should have been an action that should have been taken immediately, not to wait for us to have this kind of a hearing and see the weaknesses of the performance, and that those people were not removed immediately. So in closing, let me say that I want to thank our distinguished panel for being here this morning. Today, we've heard those concerns, but we must not forget that it plays a vitally important role in expanding college access and affordability. Moving forward, I'm confident that FSA will continue to strengthen its management systems and performance in order to best serve our student borrowers. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Meadows, I'd like to recognize you for closing comments.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your leadership on a number of areas that relate to higher education. It's certainly not only this hearing, but it's been recognized time and time again, your commitment to students, and as you so accurately put it, our constituents. So I thank you for your leadership. Instead of doing a closing statement, I'm going to hopefully ask for a few things to clarify and wrap up some of this without going to a second line of questioning. But one of the big areas that we did not address that Ms. Tai was a part of yesterday was the whole cyber aspect, because we had Dr. Harris here yesterday, and one of the questions that came up during that particular hearing made the potential liability from a cyber standpoint just frightening, Mr. Runcie. And when we asked Dr. Harris about some of the dashboard things that is on the ISA-Conley bill, or as Mr. Conley would put it, the Conley-ISA bill, it's as we look at that particular issue, Dr. Harris couldn't answer one thing, and he said that he didn't know that we would have to ask FSA. And so you're here today, so I'm going to ask you very quickly, can you explain to these committees why there is no PIV cards to protect, from an encryption standpoint, to protect the some 139 million Social Security, unique Social Security numbers that are there? Why the very basic of encryption is not employed? Because as your chief information officer, he couldn't answer it. So can you answer that?
Yeah, Dr. Harris is the department CIO. We have our own separate CIO who has 30 years.
But he said this was your call because he couldn't even look. That's the
No,
reason
that's
why I'm
fine.
asking you is because he said he couldn't look behind the curtain, that you were the only one that could look behind the curtain. So I'm asking you.
So we've had two-factor authentication for some time, right? It was level 3.
Yeah, but you went backwards. I was here yesterday. I don't want to get into all that. I guess let me ask you this question more specifically. When can we count on PIV cards being there, the basic encryption to protect all these students' Social Security numbers? When can we count on that from your agency?
By second quarter.
Okay, by second quarter of next year? I mean, let's make sure that we're talking about. Second quarter 10 years from now is a tough time.
Our target is the end of December, but there may be some constraints that move us into the next quarter. So that's why I meant that quarter.
All right.
January through March.
So in 2 quarters, you'll have it done. All right. So let me go to one other thing that a lot of people are excited about, this whole repay thing that here in just a few weeks, I guess, is going to be there. Do all the service providers, do they have what they needed to make the best decisions and all of that and to implement that, the contractors?
Yes.
And so you've been working on that, as I understand, for a while. Is that correct?
Yeah, repay, the delivery of repay, yeah.
And so dating back as far as, I guess, from my records, it showed that you had a proposed rule draft change, contract change that went out in May of 2015. Is that correct?
That sounds right.
And then a final contract change that went out in July of this year?
I believe that's right.
All right. And so I'm a little confused, and so help me with this, and I don't understand the process. But since the Secretary just put out the final rule on October the 30th, how did you send out those contract changes before a final rule was complete? I mean, was it just that we assumed that it was going to not change?
I know that we provided guidance because of the window that we were talking about. It's obviously a tight time frame, so if we waited till the last minute to give any sort of guidance or instruction.
Well, but these aren't guidance. These are contract changes, which is a lot different than guidance. And so are you assuming that the rule that just became final was going to be the final rule? Because on October 30th, the final rule, it wasn't exactly like the proposed rule. It actually changed.
I'll have to get back to you with the
Because
timeline.
it sounds like we've got things backwards.
Yeah. I can confirm the timeline and get that back.
I yield back. I thank the chairwoman for her patience.
Thank you very much. This has been a very interesting hearing. To me, a very revelatory hearing, and I want to thank Mr. Meadows for co-chairing this, and I want to thank the OGR staff and our staff for putting the hearing together. There were a couple of things that have come up here that I think are important to point out. One is the issue of complexity. You know, I've been around in federal government business for a long time. I was the director of an Upward Bound Special Services program at Appalachian State University. We dealt with financial aid and very concerned again about what our students were getting in financial aid. When we talk today about FSA's management of our broken financial aid system, I think it's important to remember that in 1990, there was only one forbearance option and 2 repayment plans. In 2015, we have 13 forbearance options, 15 repayment plans, and 8 all-new forgiveness programs. It's clear, and Mr. Runcie, this is one area you and I agree on. You mentioned you have tremendous complexity to deal with. It's clear we've allowed this system to become far too complex to serve students well. I believe it is the life of bureaucrats to make things complex. I think this administration has made things way too complex. And I think it's going to be up to us to look for ways to make the system less complex, because it is clear FSA cannot administer this program. And if you cannot administer the program, your servicers cannot administer. And I agree with Mr. Carter. It appears that there's a lot of blame being foisted upon the servicers. That's not where the problem is, Mr. Runcie. The problem is with the leadership of the FSA. If you gave clear guidelines to the servicers, if you did things in a timely fashion, we would not have this problem. And even the complexity you have generated could be gotten through. And there's no benefit to the servicers to not explain things fully to students. I've inquired about that. The only problem is they don't have the guidance from you to be able to do it. And it's so complex, even financial aid administrators don't understand it. That's not the way it should be. It's not the way it should be. Again, you are harming the people you are supposed to be helping. And that has to stop. Again, I thank all of you for being here today. I thank you for revealing a lot of things that I think will be useful to us as we look to the reauthorization of the HEA. And I appreciate the time that you've given us. This hearing's adjourned.